up the one slide that I sent you? I know we were looking at possibility of case studies, and over the last 2 days, I've been sitting in on some of these presentations and taking notes of some of the questions that have come up and where a lot of concerns are. I know a lot of times people can come to conferences like this and get a lot of information, but then how do you move forward? What's the next step that you got? So this is something prior to my work at Clear Impact. I actually worked for United Way at Greater Lorraine, just a couple hours away. This is one of the collaboratives. There were 11 collaboratives. We worked with about 130 agencies to start putting data together. And the reason I'm at Clear Impact now is because we used the results-based accountability, turn the curve thinking. Oh, sorry. Can you bring that back up? Thank you. There's a lot of lines on here. The one that I want to draw your attention to is in the upper left. What it is the high school graduation rate for Lorraine City Schools. There is a massive drop. Who's responsible for that drop? If you could think, just either shout out any answers, or if there's any comments, who's responsible for that drop? A lot of times people will say the school district, but this is what we talk about in terms of indicators. The reason that drop happened is because they had 3 high schools. They got rid of 2 of the high schools and put everybody, and all 3 high schools were demographically very different. And they put everybody into one building. And they weren't ready for the ensuing cultural chaos that happened. So it was just really interesting when you look at what measure can we look at, and how do we start building that story to make those changes? The rest of the graphs that you're looking at are just actual the state testing scores for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. If you'll notice right at the end where the data stops, it drops. There were 2 things that happened. Common Core was adopted in Ohio, and they changed the way that they did testing in the same year. So I would love to see the data further on beyond that, but I ended up leaving and doing some other stuff, and then ending up at Clear Impact. So this is just an example of how you can use some of the tools that you've been that have been available to you or shown to you over the last 2 days. This particular, the results-based accountability, you learned about turn the curve thinking with Dan Duncan this morning. So it just interesting hearing about the questions and the case studies that come out of it. And I don't know if you're able to bring up that link I sent as well. Whoa, maybe not. If you're having issues with that, that's okay. The scorecard from Clear Impact is a way to visualize the turn the curve thinking and looking at data over time. So one of the big things that I saw, in particular with the data sharing agreements, if all you're collecting, all you really want to know is a number or a percent to answer the question of how much do we do, how well did we do it, or is anyone better off? Those are super simple data sharing agreements because you're not sharing any identified information. The problem comes in, of course, my problem comes in is that people tend to fear misrepresentation of their data. And that was talked about in one of the earlier presentations, but it's because they fear that it's going to be punitive, because they either know that the data doesn't look good, or they're just not aware that really the reason you want to use it is because you want to learn from it and grow as either collaborative or a service system. Are there any, I guess, some case studies or success stories that I know people had in terms of the use of the different frameworks that have been talked about? And I guess really, go ahead.
I will clarify. So this is Dr. Buskirk. I think it's important to sort of think about the return on investment piece that Eric mentioned, right? So we often sort of think about motivating some of the work in analytics and AI around return on investment. What is that going to look like for your organization? And I think in this context, investment or return is not necessarily measured in dollars, but it's measured in something else that sort of resonates with philanthropic donors, right? And so I think it's really important to be thinking about what does a return on investment look like in your organization with respect to metrics and measurable outcomes that you can actually use in your applications and in the work that you do, so that when it comes to thinking about these models and maybe the use of data collectively or within your organizations, what is it that you're moving the needle on, right? What are the returns that you're getting? Some of these things are intangible, some of them are qualitatively assessed, and some of them can be measured with reasonable metrics that can have some really robust measurement properties that might also think about, you know, across different industries or metrics or applications. So I think it's a very important thing that to sort of realize that investment or returns on investment need not only be qualified or quantified by money, they can also be quantified by other things that are measurable. And so we should be thinking about what it is that you want to measure, how it is that you're measuring it, and is that measurement robust over time so that you can actually show to the donors a movement of the needle, so to speak.
Did anybody have any follow-up questions in that space? Okay, if not Dr. Kirk. He's ready to go. Okay, Kevin?
I'm sorry, I didn't have any follow-up questions.
Okay, did you want to add anything to the discussion? The floor is
I just
open.
I just thought that was really well said. So, I mean, I just tie it back to making sure you have the right definitions of success, having the ability to measure and monitor the programs that you're putting in place based on those success, and then got to operationalize it. And there's lots of ways to operationalize the insights, but then again, there's also a lot of ways we got to operationalize the infrastructure, everything itself. All of it has to come together for us to deliver that end value, whether it's monetary value or impact that we deliver at scale for individuals. It all has to work together.
I think one additional sort of thing to think about is, at least in terms of the success stories or how these predictive models that Eric sort of foreshadowed might work in practice, is that what we've seen in a lot of applications, so there's the DASH funding group, there's the all-in organization that I talked about yesterday, you will see countless examples of how these communities are leveraging multiple sources of data across multiple sectors to create predictive models. Like, for example, yesterday I mentioned a predictive model to figure out which houses in Chicago area are at risk of lead-based paint adverse outcomes. What areas in Flint, Michigan are going to be more susceptible to PCHs in their water? What areas in your community, in the community that you serve? We also saw examples in New York where they changed the unit of geography to neighborhood units as opposed to community segments, and they found more health disparities. These predictive models can be very useful at helping you target your interventions so that you can put the biggest impact measurable in the right place. So predictive models need not only be about sort of what's happening within your organization or portending success of your intervention. They can also be used at the design phase to help you figure out how you can best point your intervention like a laser. And this is a very fundamental piece for how you might go about writing for funding requests. If you are able to develop a community-based model like they're developing in Pittsburgh for cardiovascular risk, like they're developing in Tennessee for infant mortality, if we can come together and form some sort of analytic sort of framework that can be used for these kind of predictive models, this could be extremely valuable for planning purposes, for study interventions or interventions in the community that could be that sort of could be thought about as insurance for the intervention to work. At least people know you're pointing it in the right place, that there's some corroboration about where you're aiming your intervention. So I think that from a funding application perspective, this can be extremely valuable for the design element as well, not just evaluation. So we have to think about it on both sides of that story. And I'm really passionate about the design of these interventions and making sure that they're aimed correctly. So that would be something to really think about when you're trying to apply for funding, that you can use these on the front end as well. They're not just back end, keep them on your bookshelf, keep them in your computer and pull them out when you have the data. You can think about them before as well.
Dr. Buskirk, Kirk. Anybody else from the panel want to add to the conversation before we open the floor to the audience? Okay, before I open the floor, one thing I want to touch on is, so you hear the word data, but people such as myself and some of my colleagues who do research, that's how we refer to information. Okay, but in layman's term, information is power. Okay, and with that power, it's all about how we strategically utilize it. They talked about outcomes, using that information to get desired outcomes. That's very essential. But one thing I like that Dr. Buskirk touched on is strategic planning. Having the appropriate amount of level of information and knowing how to almost predict your outcomes to where you can take, especially a smaller nonprofit organization such as Big Brothers Big Sisters of Northwestern Ohio, you have to be very strategic, right? Have a limited amount of capabilities, limited amount of tools at hand and personnel and funding. So having that data, or we want to refer to as information, allows me to be more strategic, to have the bigger impact, which in turns prepare me when I do my next cycle of grants. Because with those outcomes, I can talk about, hey, with this level of funding capabilities, I was able to have these outcomes based on this data. So this is very important for the smaller nonprofits. And I can tell you, I've been on both sides. As a Rotarian, I sit on 5 committees. And when I go do a site visit, that's what I'm looking for. Where's your data? Before I invest in your nonprofit organization as a philanthropist, where's your data? Where's your outcomes? Where are you looking? How are you investing the dollars we assist you in raising? And so if you don't take anything else away from this whole process of this whole conference, is that data is very essential in all aspects of what you do. Sometimes we focus on outcomes, sometimes we focus on predicting and planning, but in every space, it's very important. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there because I'm seeing it from both sides. I think I really grew as a person being on this side doing the ask. I was always the one that sat on to do site visits and ask those questions as a researcher, and before we sign off on it and vote on it. But being on this side, I see some of the challenges, and I think it was a blessing me being with a smaller agency, having to fight that fight and having to answer those questions. And I always fell back on the data because I was new to the space. And because we didn't have the capability and things stood up, I had to go and pull data from other nonprofits doing similar work, similar space, and say, hey, listen, it worked there. I can bring it here and do the same thing. Yes, Wendy.
Eric, you mentioned like with analytics personnel, sort of touched on that. And so when we work in the nonprofit space, or, I'm just curious about skill set transferability, as we look at what, that field, there's such a broad range of analysts out there. Is there anything to be thoughtful about or to be afraid of, or, that sort of thing? Because an organization looking to hire might not really be profiling or writing a position description as accurately as they could for the work. And that's just a curious thing when we're situated in such a different place.
No, that's a great question. And I know that it starts with the mysterious definition of a data scientist, right? And in what role are they going to have to fulfill? Are they looking at visualization? Are they helping with general business analytics, or are they really to be focused on machine learning and predictive analytics? But the things I like to look for, I know there's a large focus on coding, and I think it's distracting from the real goal-driven analytics perspective that we should have. So I would like to see data scientists be more strategic about their views. Maybe they're not the one that sets the goal, but they have to ask questions that are going to relate to how are we going to take these artificial accuracy metrics and translate them to organizational impact. Those are the kinds of things I think are more important to test for than how well they can code Python.
If I can add to Wendy's question, I would say that if data scientists were superheroes, you'd want to hire the Wonder Twins. One Wonder Twin would be a data strategist. The other Wonder Twin would be a data wizard. And so an analytics wizard, so that you could think about, in the nonprofit space, I think one of the things that's vital is being resourceful. and being able to find data that are available for said purposes, for planning, for outcome corroboration, et cetera, you need a data strategist for that. You really need to have somebody who understands the data landscape, the data architecture, as well as being able to contribute your data to a greater collective, right? This takes curation skills. This takes a little bit of data savviness. And then you need somebody who can sort of complement or partner that with sort of all of the analytics muscle that we sort of imagine when we're thinking about these models. I've often thought, United Way is so well positioned in this space to be able to maybe offer communities this kind of hub analytics capabilities so that others can leverage their superpowers and do the work outside. But that's maybe for another day or another conference. But it is an interesting evolution that we see in the data science space. But don't forget the data curation and the data gathering piece of this that could be so vital for making organizations even more resourceful than they are.
And also, while we're in this space, Dr. Buskirk, you ended yesterday with sharing some information, just in case some of the individuals that's here today wasn't here yesterday. I think you was telling us about, can't remember the acronym, to where they can actually apply to where they can get assistance in data collection and research. Can you repeat that again for us?
Yes, it is. Can you hear me? It's through Cornell. So it's called Data Science for Social Good. So it's dssg.org. You can visit that page. It's an institute out of Cornell. They actually hire interns for summer paid positions that are then placed with organizations that have data needs or predictive analytics needs. And this is how the Chicago Department of Public Health partnered with Cornell Data Science for Social Good fellows and came up with a predictive model for the lead-based paint that I discussed yesterday. So yes, thank you. So I would take a look at this because they're looking for people who, they're looking for prospective participants for placement of fellows. So it's a place where you can apply to be one of these recipients of a fellow, and it doesn't cost you anything, but maybe some mentoring hours, and the fellows are paid by their institute. So hopefully that's helpful.
dsgfellowship.org. Okay, great. They also dropped it for the our virtual audience. They also dropped it in Dropbox. So there's no excuse. It's free and things and stuff. So reach out, utilize those resources. Do you have any other questions for the either virtually or in-house? Okay.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
No, so I am here as a resource for, I'm sorry. So I am here as a resource, as an advocate for Clear Impact, not just because of my position with Clear Impact, but because I used the framework for 5 years with 130 agencies, and I see it working, and it still works. I still see I check up on them every now and then. I pull up their scorecards, and they're updating it. They're using the framework to make these change and turn those curves. And this is all data that is unidentified that they're sharing with within their agencies, but then also from United Way's perspective, they're getting actual data from the work that's being done that they can pass on to their donors to say, look at what your dollars are doing in the community. It's insane how they're able to connect the dollars that they use with leveraged funds then after that. So it's just really interesting. And if you guys are interested in learning more about RBA, or just turn the curve thinking and the scorecard, that's what I'm a resource for.
Thank you, sir. Do any of our other panelists virtually have anything you want to add to the conversation before we close out?
I would also say that, we see a lot of success stories in this space, but I think, as I mentioned yesterday, we saw a lot of failures in the era of COVID, where people combined their data to create these predictive models of COVID case counts. And we saw that out of 900 or so models that were able to be developed over shared data, only 2 of them actually passed muster for clinical relevance. And so I would say that along your journey, not to be afraid of saying things that you don't know or being able to admit what doesn't work. Because as I'm reminded, right, even Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb that we're all using today, took about 10,000 iterations before he got it right. Might that have been faster for him if he would have known 9,500 of the ways that wouldn't have worked? And so I think it's really important for us to think as we become vulnerable with each other and thinking about data sharing and democratizing data, we need to be honest about what doesn't work, because it helps those of us to move the needle forward on what will.
Anybody else with further comments? Okay.
Yeah, I'll add to that very quickly with an illustration here, and to what Dr. Buskirk was saying here, we want to try to ask some of those questions in advance so that we don't have to go through the fail. I mean, it's good to fail fast, but if you don't have to fail at all, and you can leverage from either others' mistakes that we can have recorded, or make sure we bring the future into the present by asking questions that can diffuse bombs, that are downstream in advance. And this is more about that broader view I was taking, so that we're not building those perfectly good rockets that are launched into the abyss. And here's just a few examples. Let's make sure our leadership's vested in this. Is the data, even available at runtime that we use to train these models, so that we can truly deploy it successfully? What about user adoption? Is the environment going to support the deployment? The required team roles even available? All the different lanes we had talked about. Angela, I would be curious if you're asked to the table for a lot of these to understand how explainable these models need to be, right? We don't want to pick the wrong algorithm for a black box when we need to be able to explain the results, because there's regulatory considerations. And then there's the cultural things and the attitudes. Are we committed to the data-driven mind shift? These things really do trip up the implementations, and that's why we want to make sure we consider those in advance, as well as making sure we all agree on what the success metrics are before we start down the path of developing these models, and the time and the treasure it takes to develop them. They're expensive failures if we don't consider a lot of the things downstream that we can be asking if we have a good framework to consider all of those things.